Welcome to another slow descent into sleep. Tonight's story begins at the door of a house of sin, its lantern swaying above the cobbled alley, where laughter and whispers rose like incense into the medieval night. The year is 1400 and something, when the bells of Notre Dame called the faithful to prayer, while just beyond their reach, other prayers were being answered in coin and candlelight. Inside, the rules were unspoken but strict. Pay what is owed. Follow the rituals, wear the blessing, and you could trade in secrecy without fear of losing your soul. Here, merchants came to forget, priests came to forgive, and women learned to weave survival behind veils that told no truth. Let the bells fade for you. Let the night hold you. And if these quiet wanderings bring you comfort, you might consider subscribing or telling us where and when you're listening from. Now, close your eyes and step inside the house of sin, where shadow and salvation shared the same roof. In the year of our Lord 1400 and something, when the bells of Notre Dame still rang clear across the muddy streets of Paris, there lived those who understood that proximity to the cathedral did not necessarily guarantee salvation, though it did guarantee customers. The wise proprietor of a domus meretricum knew that location was everything, and everything was negotiable, provided one paid the correct fees to the correct officials at the correct times of year. The street called Rue des Lombards stretched like a confession between the respectable districts and the river, neither entirely holy nor entirely damned, which made it perfect for business that required both discretion and accessibility. Here, where the morning light fell softly through shutters, painted the color of old wine, one could establish an enterprise that would neither scandalize the bishop's morning walk nor inconvenience. The merchants who required certain services after their evening transactions. The cobblestones had been worn smooth by centuries of careful footsteps. Those who walked purposefully but not hurriedly, who knocked quietly but not secretly, who paid promptly but never spoke of it afterward. The building itself required consideration of several practical matters that the Church Fathers had, in their infinite wisdom, failed to address in their theological treatises. The ground floor needed to appear respectable enough to avoid immediate condemnation, yet inviting enough to encourage the sort of commerce that would pay for the monthly licensing fees. A small window facing the street, curtained in lace, that had been blessed by accident when the priest next door sneezed during his morning prayers, served to indicate availability without advertising it. The lace, always lace, never linen, for reasons that the city ordinances explained in Latin that no one bothered to translate, hung in careful folds that suggested both modesty and possibility. The licensing system, as established by the municipal authorities of Paris in the year 1370-something, required that each establishment obtain a permit from the Office of Public Morality, a department that maintained offices conveniently located next to the tax collector and directly across from the cathedral's side entrance. The official who dispensed these licenses wore robes that had faded from black to a practical gray, and he possessed the remarkable ability to examine documents without looking at them directly. as if his peripheral vision had been specially trained for the task of moral ambiguity. Fee for a license varied according to several factors that were never explicitly stated, but always implicitly understood. The proximity to churches, the visibility from respectable establishments, the likelihood that the mayor's brother-in-law might occasionally require accommodation. There was abundant, and the wars were distant. The license might cost no more than a few gold coins, and a promise to close during major feast days. In leaner times, the price rose accordingly, though the services expected in return remained diplomatically undefined. The paperwork itself was a masterpiece of ecclesiastical bureaucracy, written in a Latin so archaic that even the university scholars required several cups of wine to decipher it. It spoke of luxuria corporalis as a necessary evil, referencing the great St. Thomas Aquinas's doctrine of molem necessarium, the lesser evil that prevents the greater evil, though which depended entirely upon one's perspective and current relationship with the church hierarchy. The document granted permission to operate a house for the accommodation of travelers, with special emphasis on the spiritual comfort that might be provided to weary souls, a phrase that could be interpreted in numerous ways, all of which were probably correct. The establishment required certain physical accommodations that spoke to both practical necessity and legal requirement. The entrance needed to be neither too prominent nor too hidden, visible enough that potential customers would not mistake it for a bakery, discreet enough that the bishop's wife would not feel compelled to comment upon it. During her weekly charitable visits to the neighborhood, a small sign, carved in wood, that had been painted and repainted so many times that its original color had become a matter of theological speculation, bore simply the words hospitium discretum, discreet lodging, in letters that could be read by those who needed to read them, and ignored by those who preferred ignorance. Inside, the common room served multiple purposes that were never simultaneously acknowledged. During daylight hours, it functioned as a respectable tavern where traveling merchants could purchase wine that had been watered according to municipal regulations and bread that met the minimum standards established by the Bakers' Guild. The wooden tables bore the scars of countless transactions, negotiations, and agreements that were never committed to writing. The hearth provided warmth that was both literal and metaphorical, and the rushes scattered across the floor were changed weekly, or whenever the smell became impossible to ignore through the competing fragrances of wine, unwashed, wool, and the particular perfume that certain establishments used to create an atmosphere of mysterious invitation. The upper floors required more careful consideration of both practical and legal necessities. The rooms needed to be large enough to accommodate the various activities that respectable guests might require: private prayer, contemplation of their business ledgers, consultation with spiritual advisors who specialized in very personal forms of guidance, while remaining small enough to heat efficiently during the winter months when fuel was expensive and customers were grateful for any source of warmth. Each room contained a bed that met the minimum standards established by the church for the accommodation of pilgrims. A wooden frame that would not collapse under the weight of 2 kneeling penitents. A mattress stuffed with straw that was replaced seasonally, and linens that were washed frequently enough to avoid attracting the attention of the health inspectors. The windows presented a particular challenge that required both practical and theological consideration. They needed to provide enough light for the various activities that might occur within reading of prayer books, examination of consciences, and other forms of spiritual exercise, while maintaining the privacy that both custom and law demanded. The solution lay in the careful selection of curtains that could be drawn to create an atmosphere of intimate devotion, while remaining thin enough to suggest rather than conceal. The fabric needed to be expensive enough to indicate the quality of service provided, yet not so luxurious as to suggest that the establishment was profiting excessively from the spiritual needs of its clientele. The question of decoration required delicate balance between the sacred and the secular, the inviting and the respectable. Religious imagery was essential, both for legal protection and for the comfort of customers who might require spiritual reassurance before, during, or after their various activities. Small wooden crosses hung in each room, positioned to be visible but not intrusive, blessing the proceedings without necessarily endorsing them. Candles provided both illumination and sanctification, their flickering light creating an atmosphere that could be interpreted as either devotional or romantic, depending upon the theological sophistication of the observer. The establishment's relationship with the local church required careful cultivation through a series of donations, services, and mutual understandings that were never explicitly negotiated, but always implicitly maintained. The priest who served the parish of St. Joke received a regular contribution to his poor box, delivered by a woman who dressed respectably and never spoke above a whisper. In return, his sermons on the sins of the flesh remained general enough to avoid, naming specific establishments while maintaining sufficient moral authority to satisfy the bishop's expectations of spiritual guidance. The practical matter of supplies required connections with merchants who understood the unique needs of an establishment that provided both temporal and spiritual services. The wine needed to be of sufficient quality to justify the prices charged, yet not so expensive as to suggest that customers were paying for more than simple refreshments. The bread required similar consideration, fresh enough to avoid complaints, affordable enough to provide without bankrupting the operation, blessed enough to maintain the spiritual atmosphere that legal protection required. Linen presented particular challenges that were addressed through arrangements with washerwomen who possessed both skill and discretion. The sheets needed to be cleaned frequently enough to maintain health standards, yet the washing could not be so obviously regular as to suggest the precise nature of the services provided. The solution lay in contracting with laundresses, who also served the local monastery, creating a system of mutual dependence that ensured both quality and silence. The staff required for such an establishment needed to possess qualities that were rarely found in combination: discretion, efficiency, attractiveness, and most importantly, the ability to provide comfort without creating complications. The women who worked in such places were neither saints nor sinners, but rather practitioners of a profession that had existed since biblical times and would continue until the second coming, regardless of whatever laws or sermons might be directed against it. They required accommodation that met their practical needs while maintaining their legal protection. Rooms of their own, meals that sustained them through their labors, clothing that met municipal requirements for identification without creating unnecessary burdens, and most importantly, the assurance that their work was neither condemned nor celebrated, but simply acknowledged as a necessity of the fallen world. The financial management of such an establishment required record-keeping that satisfied multiple authorities, while revealing nothing that might prove inconvenient during periodic inspections. The account books needed to demonstrate sufficient income to justify the licensing fees, while avoiding figures that might suggest excessive profit from activities that were officially tolerated rather than endorsed. The art lay in creating records that were both accurate and incomprehensible, detailed enough to satisfy bureaucratic requirements, while vague enough to avoid theological complications. Brawls evenings settled over the Rue des Lombards, and the cathedral bells rang vespers across the darkening city. The establishment prepared for the quiet business that would sustain it through another night. The lace curtains were adjusted to their proper position, neither to open nor to close. The candles were lit in their designated holders, and the account book was opened to a fresh page that would soon record transactions that were both sacred and profaned, necessary and regrettable, profitable and expensive. The shutters were drawn to their appropriate position, creating rectangles of golden light that spilled discreetly onto the cobblestones below. The ledger lay open on the wooden table, its pages ready to receive the careful notations that would record the evening's commerce in terms that could be understood by accountants and misunderstood by bishops. The lace hung motionless in the still air, tell you how to pill, and the night settled over the street like a familiar blessing, bringing with it the quiet customers whose needs were both temporal and eternal, and whose coins would ensure that the establishment continued its ancient and necessary service to the community of souls who found themselves in need of comfort in a world that offered precious little of it. The morning brought with it the familiar ritual of preparation that marked the difference between a respectable establishment and a notorious one, though the distinction was often a matter of perspective rather than practice. In the grey light that filtered through windows that had been carefully positioned to reveal nothing while suggesting everything, the women who worked in the house on Rue des Lombards prepared themselves for another day of providing services that were simultaneously essential and forbidden, regulated and condemned, taxed and blessed. The yellow scarf presented the first challenge of the day, and perhaps the most delicate. According to the municipal ordinances of Paris, amended in the year 1380-something, after a series of incidents that were never fully explained in the official records, women engaged in the profession of providing comfort to travelers were required to wear visible identification that distinguished them from respectable wives and daughters. The scarf needed to be yellow, not gold, which was reserved for the wives of goldsmiths, not amber, which belonged to the merchant class, but yellow, the color of autumn leaves and butter and certain theological concepts that were best not examined too closely. The wearing of the yellow scarf required an expertise that was passed from one generation of practitioners to another, a knowledge that could not be learned from books or sermons, but only through the careful observation of what worked and what led to uncomfortable conversations with officials who possessed the authority to revoke licenses. The scarf needed to be visible enough to satisfy legal requirements, yet worn in such a manner that it enhanced rather than diminished the wearer's attractiveness. It could be draped across the shoulders like a benediction, wound around the throat like a prayer, or tied at the waist like a ribbon of sunshine. But it must always be present, always yellow, and always positioned in such a way that observers would understand both what was being offered and what was being protected. And practical appeal. The dress needed to be modest enough to avoid accusations of indecency, yet attractive enough to encourage the sort of attention that would result in profitable transactions. The fabric could not be silk, which was restricted to the nobility and their wives, nor could it be the rough wool that marked the peasant class. Instead, it needed to be something in between, a cloth that suggested comfort without luxury, respectability without poverty, availability without desperation. The sleeves presented particular challenges that had been addressed by the fashion industry with characteristic ingenuity. They needed to be long enough to maintain modesty during daylight hours, when the establishment functioned as a respectable tavern, yet easily adjustable for the evening activities that provided the majority of the income. The solution lay in sleeves that could be tied, untied, rolled, unrolled, and generally modified according to the requirements of the moment, creating garment that was both practical and symbolically appropriate for women, whose lives required constant adaptation to changing circumstances. Matter of fees required an understanding of economics that would have impressed the merchants of Florence, though the principles were rarely discussed in the universities where such subjects were supposedly taught. The basic rate for services needed to be affordable enough to ensure steady clientele, yet high enough to maintain the quality that distinguished a respectable establishment from the sort of places that operated without licenses in the alleys behind the fish market. The currency accepted presented its own complications. Gold coins from customers who could afford discretion, silver from those who required credit arrangements, copper from those who paid in advance, and occasionally goods or services from those whose circumstances had reduced them to bartering, presented both an opportunity for additional income and a necessity for creating the atmosphere that customers expected when they sought comfort away from their wives, confessors, and business partners. The establishment needed to maintain a selection that ranged from the watered wine served during daylight hours to the stronger vintages that wine significant portion of the establishment's income. Yet it needed to be reasonable enough that customers did not feel they were being taken advantage of, even when they clearly were. The bread served multiple purposes. that extended beyond simple nourishment. During the day, it provided substance for travelers who required actual food rather than metaphorical comfort. During the evening, it served to absorb some of the wine that customers consumed, reducing the likelihood of incidents that might require the intervention of the watch or the attention of the authorities. The bread needed to be fresh enough to be palatable, yet not so expensive as to significantly impact the establishment's profits. The solution lay in arrangements with bakers who provided dialed bread at reduced prices, a transaction that benefited both parties while maintaining the quality standards that customers expected. The feast days presented the greatest challenge to the establishments: financial stability, requiring a careful balance between legal compliance and economic survival. The Church, in its infinite wisdom, had designated numerous days throughout the year when establishments providing certain services were required to close their doors, lock their shutters, and pretend that the needs they served simply disappeared during periods of heightened spiritual observance. Lent was particularly challenging, lasting 40 days, during which the establishment was required to cease all but the most basic operations, serving only bread and watered wine, while the women who worked there found alternative employment, or simply waited for Easter with the patience of saints who had chosen a different sort of martyrdom. The Feast of All Saints presented similar difficulties, as did the various days dedicated to martyrs who had died for their faith, rather than lived for their customers' comfort. Christmas required a particularly delicate approach, as the celebration of the Nativity demanded both respect for the sacred mystery and acknowledgement of the practical reality that men separated from their families by distance or circumstance might require consolation during the season of joy. The solution lay in offering special services, prayers for absent loved ones, readings from appropriate scriptures, and other forms of spiritual comfort that happened to take place in private rooms with beds, candles, and carefully positioned religious imagery. The management of feast day closures required financial planning that would have impressed the papal treasury. The income lost during mandatory closures needed to be compensated by increased activity during permitted periods, creating a seasonal rhythm that shaped both the establishment's operations and the lives of the women who worked there. The weeks preceding Lent became periods of intensive activity, as customers sought to satisfy their needs before entering the period of mandatory restraint. The days following Easter brought their own surge of activity, as men who had spent 40 days in contemplation of their spiritual condition discovered that their temporal needs had not disappeared during their period of enforced piety. The city officials who monitored compliance with feast day regulations possessed a remarkable ability to appear at precisely the moments when establishments might be tempted to violate the closure requirements. They traveled in pairs, wore clothing that had been blessed by priests who understood the importance of maintaining moral standards, and carried documents that authorized them to inspect any establishment that claimed to provide accommodation for travelers. Their visits were announced by the sound of their boots on cobblestones and accompanied by conversations conducted in voices that were loud enough to be heard through closed doors. giving proprietors sufficient warning to ensure that any activities in progress could be quickly transformed into prayer meetings or business consultations. The fines for operating during prohibited periods were calculated according to a formula that took into account the sanctity of the particular feast being violated, the proximity of the establishment to religious institutions, and the current state of the city's finances. Minor violations during Lesser Saints' days might result in penalties equivalent to a few days' income, while major infractions during High Holy Days could cost enough to threaten the establishment's continued operation. The wise proprietor maintained a reserve fund specifically for such contingencies, viewing the occasional fine as a form of insurance rather than punishment. The women who worked during feast days required special consideration, as their activities took on additional theological significance during periods of heightened religious observance. They were required to attend morning prayers at the local church, demonstrating their commitment to spiritual as well as temporal welfare. Their clothing during feast days needed to be particularly modest, their behavior especially discreet, and their services limited to those forms of comfort that could be justified as charitable works rather than commercial transactions. The matter of payment during feast days required careful handling to avoid accusations of profiting from religious observance. The solution lay in treating such payments as donations to support the charitable works that the establishment provided to the community. The care of travelers, the provision of comfort to the afflicted, the offering of sanctuary to those whose souls were troubled by the burdens of worldly existence. The account books recorded these transactions as contributions to the poor box, though the particular poor being supported were never specifically identified. The preparation of the establishment for feast day operations required both practical and spiritual considerations. The rooms needed to be cleaned with particular thoroughness, as if preparing for the visit of especially distinguished guests. Fresh linens were installed, new candles were blessed and positioned, and religious imagery was dusted and prominently displayed. The common room was arranged to facilitate prayer meetings, Bible readings, and other forms of spiritual exercise that might be required by guests, whose needs during feast days were particularly complex. The wine served during feast days required special selection to ensure that it supported rather than hindered the spiritual activities that were the establishment's primary concern during such periods. The stronger vintages were reserved for private consultations that might require additional courage or inspiration, while the common areas served only wine that had been sufficiently watered to encourage contemplation rather than celebration. The bread offered during feast days was blessed by the priest of Lectok, creating an atmosphere of sanctification that enhanced the spiritual benefits that guests derived from their visits. As evening approached on another feast day in the calendar of the church, the establishment on Rue des Lombards prepared for the quiet activities that would sustain both body and soul through another night of necessary service. The yellow scarves were carefully adjusted. The wine was blessed and watered according to the requirements of the day, and the account book was opened to pages that would record transactions in terms that satisfied both earthly authorities and heavenly observers. The shutters remained partially closed, creating an atmosphere of reverent discretion appropriate to the sacred nature of the day. The ledger lay ready to receive entries that would be recorded as charitable contributions, spiritual consultations, and acts of mercy toward travelers whose needs extended beyond simple accommodation. The candles flickered in their holders like prayers made visible, and the night settled over the establishment with the quiet blessing of those who understood that comfort came in many forms, all of which were necessary in a world where the distinction between sacred and profane was often a matter of perspective, timing, and careful record-keeping. The bathhouse attached to the establishment on Rue des Lombards served purposes that were both more and less than what appeared in the municipal licenses, which described it simply as a facility for the cleansing of travelers who had journeyed far from their homes and their usual standards of hygiene. The great wooden tubs, carved from oak, that had been blessed accidentally when the bishop's cart had overturned nearby, were filled with water that was heated over fires that burned day and night, creating an atmosphere of perpetual preparation that suggested both spiritual and temporal purification. The water itself required careful management according to principles that were both economic and theological. Fresh water was expensive, requiring the services of men who carried it from wells that were controlled by the church and taxed by the municipality. The wise proprietor understood that water, like wine, could be recycled through a series of uses that maximized its value while maintaining the standards that customers expected. The first use was reserved for guests who paid the highest fees and required the clearest conscience afterward. The second use served those whose needs were less complex, but whose coins were equally welcome. The third and subsequent uses were employed for washing linens, cleaning floors, and other purposes that supported the establishment's operations without directly contributing to its customers' spiritual welfare. The heating of the bath water required fuel that was obtained through arrangements with suppliers who understood the unique needs of establishments that operated during hours when most respectable businesses were closed. Wood was purchased from merchants who delivered after dark and asked no questions about the purposes for which it would be used. The fires were tended by women who possessed the particular skill of maintaining the precise temperature that would cleanse without scalding, comfort without corrupting, and warm without wasting the expensive fuel that made such comfort possible. The bathing chamber itself was arranged to accommodate the various activities that naturally occurred when men and women found themselves together in warm water, dim lighting, and circumstances that encouraged both physical and spiritual intimacy. The room was large enough to provide privacy, while remaining small enough to heat efficiently. The walls were lined with wooden benches where bathers could rest between their various ablutions, and hooks were provided for the garments that were temporarily unnecessary during the cleansing process. The herbs that were added to the bath water served multiple purposes that were both medicinal and commercial. Lavender provided a fragrance that was believed to encourage spiritual contemplation, while making the establishments, services, more memorable to customers who might return with their friends and business associates. Rosemary was thought to were favorable to the sort of transactions that took place between consenting adults who had found themselves in warm water together. Other herbs selected for their ability to address the various ailments that might result from the intimate activities that were the establishment's specialty, though such medicinal benefits were never explicitly advertised. The bread served in the establishment required consideration of both nutritional and symbolic value, as it needed to sustain both bodies and souls through activities that were physically demanding and spiritually complex. The daily bread was obtained from bakers who understood that establishments serving travelers required loaves that could be consumed throughout the day and night, maintaining their palatability during extended periods when customers might require nourishment to continue their various forms of spiritual exercise. The stale bread presented both a problem and an opportunity that was addressed through arrangements with the local poor, who were always in need of sustenance, regardless of its age or origin. The bread that was no longer suitable for paying customers was distributed as charitable donations, creating goodwill in the community while reducing waste. This charitable work was recorded in the establishment's account books as evidence of the moral purpose that justified its continued operation. Though the recipients of such charity were rarely informed of the specific source of their daily bread, the back room served purposes that were never explicitly described in any official document, though its existence was acknowledged through various indirect references in licenses, tax records, and the occasional complaint from neighbors who possessed inconveniently acute hearing. The room was reached through a corridor that required knowledge of the hotel establishment's layout, creating a natural barrier that ensured only appropriate persons would accidentally discover its location. The door was constructed to prevent both unauthorized entry and unauthorized observation, using techniques of carpentry that had been developed through centuries of experience with the need for discreet accommodation. The furnishings of the back room reflected both the practical requirements of its users and the legal necessity of maintaining plausible alternatives, explanations for its existence. The large table could serve for business meetings, contract negotiations, or private dining for guests whose transactions required additional privacy. The comfortable chairs provided seating for consultations that might extend through several hours of detailed discussion. The bed, while obviously present, was positioned to suggest that it served primarily as additional seating during crowded meetings, rather than as the focal point of the room's activities. The ledger kept in the back room recorded transactions that were both more honest and more discreet than those maintained in the public accounting books. Here, the true nature of the establishment's services was documented in terms that could be understood by those who needed to understand them while remaining incomprehensible to casual observers. The entries were made in a combination of Latin, local dialect, and symbols that had been developed through generations of practitioners who understood the importance of accurate record-keeping that revealed nothing to inappropriate audiences. The bishop presented the most delicate challenge to the establishments. The morality was absolute, while his practical ability to interfere with licensed businesses was limited by laws that had been carefully crafted to protect municipal revenue streams. The solution lay in ensuring that the bishop never found himself in possession of information that would require him to take action that might damage both his moral authority and the city's tax base. The ledger was therefore constructed to be simultaneously accurate and invisible, detailed and incomprehensible, complete and utterly discreet. The relationship between the establishment and the bishop was maintained through a series of charitable donations, community services, and mutual understandings that were never explicitly negotiated, but always carefully observed. The women who worked in the establishment attended morning mass with a regularity that impressed even the most devout parishioners. Their contributions to the poor box were generous enough to fund several charitable works that enhanced the bishop's reputation for spiritual leadership. Their behavior in public was so modest and respectful that visiting clergy often commended the parish for the exemplary moral character of its female population. The soap used in the establishment was obtained through arrangements with monasteries that produced such necessities as part of their spiritual discipline, creating a supply chain that was both blessed and economically favorable. The monks who manufactured the soap were renowned for their attention to quality and their complete lack of curiosity about the purposes for which their products were employed. The soap was made from ingredients that were known to be both cleansing and pleasant, producing sort of results that encouraged customers to return for additional purification. The linens presented challenges that were addressed through relationships with washerwomen, who possessed both skill and the sort of discretion that came from understanding the nature of human frailty and the economics of forgiveness. The sheets, blankets, and towels used in the establishment required frequent laundering that removed both physical evidence and spiritual residue from the activities they had witnessed. The washing was performed using techniques that had been developed through generations of experience with the particular challenges of cleaning items that had been used for purposes that were both sacred and profane. The evening preparations for the back room required attention to details that would ensure both customer satisfaction and legal protection. The candles needed to be positioned to provide sufficient light for the various activities that might occur, while creating an atmosphere that was conducive to the sort of intimacy that customers sought when they visited. Establishments that specialized in providing comfort to weary souls. The wine served in the back room was of higher quality than that available in the common areas, reflecting both the increased fees charged for privacy and the enhanced services that such fees were intended to support. The women who worked in the back room possessed qualifications that were both more complex and more valuable than those required for service in the common areas of the establishment. They needed to be skilled in providing comfort that addressed both physical and spiritual needs, capable of conversation that could range from theological speculation to business consultation, and possessed of the particular wisdom that allowed them to offer guidance to men whose lives had become complicated by the various pressures of medieval existence. Their compensation reflected both the specialized nature of their services and the discretion that was essential to the establishment's continued operation. The morning cleaning of the back room required techniques that had been developed through centuries of experience with the challenge of removing evidence while preserving the atmosphere that made the room valuable to its users. The floors were scrubbed with solutions that eliminated stains, while enhancing the natural beauty of the wood. The walls were wiped with cloths that had been blessed by accident during various religious ceremonies, creating an environment that was both purified and sanctified. The furniture was polished with oils that provided both protection and a subtle fragrance that suggested cleanliness without advertising. The frequency with which such cleaning was required. As another day concluded in the establishment on Rue des Lombards, the back room was prepared for the evening's activities with the care that had sustained the business through decades of changing authorities, shifting moral fashions, and the occasional inconvenient reform movement that temporarily threatened establishments that provided necessary services to a community that preferred not to acknowledge their necessity. The ledger was hidden in its designated location. The soap was positioned for easy access, and the room was arranged to accommodate whatever forms of comfort its visitors might require. The bath water steamed gently in its wooden containers, warmed by fires that would burn through the night. The bread sat ready on its wooden boards, sustaining those whose spiritual exercises required temporal nourishment. The back room waited in discreet silence, prepared to provide the privacy that allowed men to address needs that were both deeply personal and completely understandable. The night settled over the establishment like a familiar blessing, bringing with it the customers whose coins would ensure that the ancient and necessary work of providing comfort would continue for another day. The morning brought with it the particular challenge that separated successful establishments from those that attracted the sort of attention that led to uncomfortable conversations with authorities who possessed both power and insufficient discretion. The art of being forgotten required a mastery of techniques that were passed down through generations of practitioners who understood that visibility was the enemy of longevity, and that the most profitable business was that which was never discussed at the baker's stalls or remembered during confession. Names presented the first and most fundamental challenge in this delicate art. The women who worked in the establishment were known by appellations that changed with the seasons, the customers, and the particular requirements of legal documentation. Marie might become Marguerite when the tax collectors arrived, then transform into Matilda when dealing with the health inspectors, and finally settle into complete anonymity when circumstances required the sort of invisibility that could only be achieved through the careful elimination of all identifying characteristics. The customers, in turn, were never addressed by name, never asked for identifications, and never remembered in any detail that might prove inconvenient during periods when their wives, confessors, or business partners might make inquiries about their evening activities. The practice of forgetting required active cultivation rather than passive neglect, as it involved the systematic elimination of details that might accumulate into patterns that could be recognized by observers who possessed either excessive curiosity or insufficient understanding of the value of discretion. The women who worked in the establishment developed memories that were both precise and selective, recalling exactly which services had been provided and completely forgetting which customers had requested them. This skill was essential for maintaining the sort of professional relationships that encouraged repeat business, while avoiding the complications that arose when customers began to fear that their private affairs might become subjects of public discussion. The burning of linens represented both a practical necessity and a symbolic act that marked the establishment's commitment to ensuring that evidence of its activities disappeared as completely as the desires that activities requiring the highest levels of discretion were not merely washed but were completely destroyed, their ashes scattered in locations that were chosen for their ability to ensure permanent dispersal. This practice, while expensive, created the sort of absolute security that justified the premium prices charged for the establishment's most sensitive services. Destruction of linens followed a schedule that was determined by both the lunar calendar and the arrival of potentially problematic visitors. The new moon provided optimal conditions for activities that required darkness and discretion, while the approach of episcopal visitations or municipal inspections triggered accelerated cycles of elimination that ensured nothing remained to complicate official examinations. The women who performed this work possessed skills that had been developed through generations of experience with the particular challenges of destroying evidence while maintaining the appearance of normal household maintenance. The management of customer recognition required techniques that would have impressed the diplomatic corps of any European court, as it involved the careful balance between acknowledging repeat visitors sufficiently to encourage continued patronage while maintaining the sort of anonymity protected all parties from the consequences of their perfectly natural, the human needs. Regular customers were greeted with warmth that suggested familiarity without implying knowledge, served with efficiency that indicated experience without revealing specifics, and treated with discretion that assured them of their continued welcome, while guaranteeing their continued anonymity. The challenge of avoiding repeat encounters outside the establishment required careful study of the daily routines of regular customers, ensuring that the women who served them would not accidentally encounter them in contexts where recognition might prove embarrassing to all parties. This knowledge was maintained through observation systems that would have impressed military intelligence services, involving networks of informants who tracked the movements of significant customers through the city's streets, markets, and religious institutions. The information gathered through these networks was used to coordinate schedules that minimized the possibility of awkward encounters in public spaces. The twice-looking rule represented one of the fundamental principles of the establishment's operations, requiring that staff members never look directly at the same customer twice during any single visit, and never look at any customer at all during subsequent visits. This technique, which required considerable practice to master, created an atmosphere of discretion that was so complete that customers could convince themselves that they had never been truly seen, heard, or remembered by anyone capable of identifying them later. The psychological comfort provided by this illusion justified significant premiums in the establishment's fee structure. The art of conversation required the development of techniques that allowed the women who worked in the establishment to provide the sort of companionship that customers sought, while carefully avoiding the exchange of information that might prove problematic if recalled during inappropriate moments. Conversations were steered toward subjects that were both engaging and forgettable. Theological speculation that could be dismissed as the sort of discussions that might occur in any tavern. Business advice that was too general to be traced to specific sources, and personal revelations that were simultaneously intimate and completely generic. The elimination of physical evidence required attention to details that extended far beyond the obvious necessities of cleaning and maintenance. Hair left on pillows needed to be removed and destroyed. Wine stains required treatment that eliminated not merely the discoloration, but also the possibility of determining which vintages had been consumed. Perfumes needed to be neutralized rather than simply covered, as their lingering presence could trigger memories that were better left undisturbed. Even the wear patterns on furniture required management, as repeated use in particular configurations might create evidence of activities that were better forgotten. The elimination of physical evidence required attention to details that extended far beyond the obvious necessities of cleaning and maintenance. Hair left on pillows needed to be removed and destroyed. Wine stains required treatment that eliminated not merely the discoloration, but also the possibility of determining which vintages had been consumed. Perfumes needed to be neutralized rather than simply covered, as their lingering presence could trigger memories that were better left undisturbed. Even the wear patterns on furniture required management, as repeated use in particular configurations might create evidence of activities that were better forgotten. The training of new staff members included intensive instruction in the various techniques of forgetting, as newcomers often possessed dangerous tendencies toward remembering details that were better consigned to oblivion. They were taught to observe without recording, to listen without retaining, and to participate without later reflecting upon their participation. This education was provided through practical exercises that gradually developed the particular form of selective amnesia that was essential for long-term success in the profession. The handling of personal items left behind by customers required protocols that protected both the establishment and its clientele from the consequences of absent-mindedness. Items of value were held for precisely 1 week, during which time their owners could reclaim them, without explanation or identification. After this period, they were destroyed or donated to charity, depending upon their nature and the likelihood that their continued existence might prove problematic. Clothing was always destroyed, as garments retained odors and other traces that could link them to their owners. Coins and jewelry were donated to the church, creating goodwill while ensuring that valuable items did not accumulate in ways that might suggest systematic collection from forgetful customers. The documentation of forgotten encounters required the maintenance of records that were simultaneously complete and completely useless for any purpose other than satisfying the bureaucratic requirements that governed licensed establishments. The ledger contained entries that recorded every transaction in terms that were technically accurate while revealing nothing that could embarrass anyone involved. Services were described using Latin phrases that could be interpreted in numerous ways. Customers were identified through systems of symbols that changed regularly, and dates were recorded according to saints' days that provided sufficient precision for accounting purposes, while creating enough ambiguity to protect everyone's reputation. The seasonal cycles of forgetting followed patterns that were determined by the church calendar, the municipal festival schedule, and the particular rhythms of human nature that created predictable periods of increased activity, followed by equally predictable periods of remorse and temporary reform. The weeks preceding Lent brought customers who sought to satisfy their needs before entering the period of mandatory restraint, while the days following major feast days attracted those whose spiritual celebrations had left them in need of more temporal forms of comfort. The establishment's ability to forget these patterns was essential for maintaining the illusion that such cycles were coincidental rather than entirely predictable. The art of serving without seeing required the development of techniques that allowed the staff to provide professional service while maintaining the sort of blindness that protected everyone involved from the consequences of recognition. Food and drink were served by women who looked only at the items they were handling, never at the faces of those they served. Conversations were conducted with eyes fixed on neutral objects, candle flames, wine cups, religious imagery that provided focal points that did not include potentially recognizable features. This studied inattention created an atmosphere of professional anonymity that was both comforting and economically valuable. The management of repeat customers required the most sophisticated applications of the forgetting arts, as these individuals represented the establishment's most valuable clientele, while simultaneously presenting its greatest security risks. Regular visitors needed to feel welcomed without being recognized, valued without being remembered, and accommodated without being identified. This was achieved through systems of service that were both consistent and anonymous, providing the same high quality of attention while maintaining complete ignorance of the recipient's identity or previous visits. The training in memory management extended to the development of techniques for forgetting information that had been inadvertently acquired through the normal processes of providing intimate services. Women who worked in the establishment learned to compartmentalize their experiences, retaining the professional skills that made them valuable while discarding the personal details that made such skills dangerous. They developed the ability to remember techniques without recalling, applications, to retain preferences without connecting them to specific individuals, and to maintain expertise while eliminating all traces of how such expertise had been developed. The physical arrangement of the establishment supported the practices of forgetting through architectural features that minimized the possibility of unwanted recognition. Corridors were designed to prevent direct sight. Lines between rooms, ensuring that customers would not encounter each other during their visits. Entrances and exits were arranged to allow departure without observation by arriving visitors. Lighting was positioned to illuminate activities while leaving faces in shadow, creating conditions that were conducive to intimacy while protecting anonymity. The seasonal destruction of records followed cycles that were timed to coincide with periods when official attention was focused elsewhere. The approach of harvest season, with its demands for agricultural labor and taxation, provided optimal opportunities for eliminating documentation that had served its bureaucratic purpose, while accumulating potentially dangerous details. The records were destroyed through fires that were indistinguishable from normal heating activities, their ashes scattered in locations that ensured complete dispersal and permanent elimination. As evening approached, the establishment en Rue des Lombards prepared for another night of activities that would be both memorable and forgotten, profitable and invisible, documented and completely anonymous. The women who worked there adjusted their clothing to ensure that they were both attractive and unrecognizable, their faces arranged in expressions that were welcoming without being distinctive. The candles were positioned to create atmosphere while preserving anonymity, their flames flickering like thoughts that appeared briefly before vanishing into darkness. The ledger lay open to pages that would record transactions in terms that satisfied legal requirements while revealing nothing that could embarrass anyone involved. The wine stood ready to provide the sort of courage and forgetfulness that made such transactions possible, its effects calculated to enhance comfort while eliminating inconvenient memories. The rooms were prepared to accommodate activities that would be both intensely personal and completely anonymous, their furnishings arranged to provide every comfort while preserving every secret. The night settled over the establishment like a familiar blessing of oblivion, bringing with it customers whose names would never be spoken, whose faces would never be remembered, and whose needs would be satisfied with the sort of professional discretion that had sustained the ancient and necessary art of being forgotten. The shutters closed against the world outside. The accounts were settled in currencies that left no traces, and the establishment continued its quiet work of providing comfort, while preserving the illusion that such comfort had never been required, never been sought, and never been found. The evening hours brought with them a quality of light that transformed the establishment en Rue des Lombards from a place of active commerce into something approaching sanctuary, where the harsh necessities of daily survival softened into the gentler rhythms of approaching rest. The candles, which had burned throughout the day in their designated positions, began to show the signs of their long service, the wax pooling in patterns that had become as familiar as prayer responses, the flames drawing lower as they consumed the last of their fuel, creating shadows that moved with the subtle breath of a building that had begun its nightly preparations for sleep. The recognition of the proper moment for closure required an understanding of rhythms that were both natural and commercial, as the establishment needed to remain available for customers whose needs were genuine, while avoiding the the sort of late-night visitors whose intentions were complicated by excessive consumption of wine, insufficient funds, or the particular form of spiritual crisis that occurred when men realized that morning would bring consequences for evening activities. The wise proprietor learned to read the signs that indicated when the night's profitable activities had concluded and the period of potential difficulty had begun. The sound of the cathedral bells provided one reliable indicator of the appropriate time for closure, as their final ringing marked the hour when respectable establishments secured their premises and respectable people retired to contemplate the day's activities in the privacy of their own chambers. The bells carried across the darkened city with a clarity that was enhanced by the absence of daytime noise, their bronze voices proclaiming the hour when commerce should yield to contemplation, when temporal needs should give way to spiritual preparation, and when locked doors should protect the innocent sleep that would prepare both body and soul for the challenges of another day. The assessment of remaining customers required diplomatic skills that were essential for encouraging departure without causing offense to individuals whose future patronage was valuable to the establishment's continued prosperity. Regular customers who had concluded their business were gently reminded of the advancing hour through subtle indications, the trimming of wicks that reduced illumination, the clearing of wine cups that suggested the evening's service was drawing to a close, the gradual withdrawal of staff to positions that indicated preparation for shutdown, rather than continued availability for additional services. The securing of the establishment began with the collection and counting of the evening's receipts, a process that required both mathematical precision and theological flexibility, as the income needed to be recorded in terms that satisfied municipal tax requirements while avoiding figures that might suggest excessive profit from activities that were officially tolerated rather than endorsed. The coins were sorted according to their origins, their conditions, and their denominations, creating neat piles that represented the tangible results of intangible services that had been provided to customers whose needs were both deeply personal and completely understandable. The account book received its final entries of the day in handwriting that had been carefully trained to be both legible and unrevealing, recording transactions in language that could be interpreted by those who needed to interpret it, while remaining meaningless to casual observers. The ink used for these entries was prepared according to formulas that ensured both permanence and discretion, creating records that would satisfy legal requirements for the appropriate period before fading into the sort of obscurity that protected everyone involved from the consequences of excessive documentation. The extinguishing of candles followed a specific sequence that had been developed through years of experience with the particular challenges of maintaining an establishment that needed to transition smoothly from active commerce to protective dormancy. The candles in the common areas were extinguished first, creating an atmosphere that discouraged new arrivals, while providing sufficient illumination for the completion of closing activities. The candles in private rooms were allowed to burn down naturally, their flames consuming the last of their wax as the final customers completed their business, and prepared to return to their other lives. The locking of doors required attention to both security and symbolism, as the establishment needed to protect both its physical assets and its reputation from the sort of overnight intrusions that could complicate relationships with authorities, who preferred to maintain their willful ignorance of the establishment's precise activities. The front door was secured with locks that had been blessed by priests who understood the importance of protecting places where travelers found rest, while the back entrances were barred with devices that ensured privacy without suggesting that the establishment had anything to hide from legitimate authorities. The preparation of sleeping quarters for the women who lived and worked in the establishment required consideration of both comfort and security, as they needed rest that would restore their energy for another day's work, while remaining available for customers whose needs might arise during the later hours of the night. Their chambers were located in portions of the building that provided both privacy and protection, furnished with beds, that offered genuine comfort rather than the functional accommodation provided in the working areas of the establishment. The evening prayers that concluded each day were conducted with a sincerity that might have surprised observers who assumed that women engaged in such professions had forfeited their spiritual connections along with their conventional respectability. These prayers were offered for the health and happiness of customers, the prosperity of the establishment, the discretion of authorities, and the forgiveness of sins that were both necessary and regrettable. The prayers were conducted in Latin that had been learned from priests who understood that spiritual guidance was needed most by those whose circumstances were most complicated. The final inspection of the premises ensured that nothing remained to complicate the following day's activities or attract unwanted attention from authorities who might conduct surprise visits during the quiet hours when establishments were expected to be dormant. The floors were swept clean of any evidence that might indicate the precise nature of the evening's activities. The furniture was returned to positions that suggested respectable accommodation rather than specialized service. The religious imagery was dusted and repositioned to create an atmosphere of devotion that would impress morning visitors who might arrive before the establishment had completed its transformation back to daytime operations. The soap that remained from the evening's bathing activities was collected and stored according to procedures that ensured both economy and security, as the particular fragrances used by the establishment needed to be eliminated before morning brought visitors, whose business was more conventional and whose expectations did not include encountering the evidence of the establishment's evening activities. The soap was dissolved in water that would be used for morning cleaning activities, creating solutions that would purify the establishment while eliminating any traces of the previous night's more intimate purifications. The ledger was secured in its designated hiding place using techniques that had been developed through centuries of experience with the need to protect financial records from examination by authorities, who possessed the legal right to inspect such documents but lacked the diplomatic wisdom to ignore their more revealing contents. The hiding place was constructed to be both completely secure and entirely innocuous. appearing to contain nothing more interesting than the sort of household supplies that any respectable establishment would maintain for the comfort of its guests. The wine that remained from the evening's service was evaluated according to standards that balanced economy with quality, as partially consumed bottles could not be served to new customers, while completely wasted wine represented an unnecessary reduction in profits. The solution lay in systems for blending and redistribution that maintained quality standards while maximizing the use of expensive inventory. Wine that had been opened but not finished was combined with fresh supplies, according to formulas that had been developed through years of experience with the particular challenges of maintaining consistent quality while minimizing waste. The women who had worked through the evening began their own preparations for rest with rituals that were both practical and spiritual, as they needed to cleanse themselves of the physical and emotional residues of their professional activities, while preparing their souls for the sort of sleep that would restore their capacity for another day's work. These preparations included both the physical washing that removed the obvious traces of their labors, and the spiritual exercises that cleansed their consciences of the more subtle burdens that accumulated through the practice of their ancient and necessary profession. As the final candle flickered toward extinction in the establishment on Jeu des Lombards, the building settled into the quiet rhythms of approaching sleep, with the satisfaction of another day's work, completed according to the standards that had sustained such establishments through centuries of changing laws, shifting moral fashions, and the occasional reform. Movement that temporarily threatened institutions that provided necessary services to communities that preferred not to acknowledge their necessity. The shutters were drawn closed against the night air that carried the sounds of a city settling toward sleep, the distant bells that marked the hours, the footsteps of late travelers making their way home, the whispered conversations of those whose business required the cover of darkness. The ledger was closed and hidden, its pages recording another day's transactions in terms that satisfied legal requirements, while revealing nothing that could embarrass anyone involved. The accounts were balanced, the doors were locked, and the establishment prepared to rest, until morning brought new customers with needs that were both ancient and immediate. The lace curtains hung motionless in the still air, their folds creating patterns that suggested both modesty and invitation, even in the darkness that concealed their details from casual observers. The soap retained its fragrance for a few moments longer before dissolving into the cleaning. Plus solutions that would purify the establishment for another day's service. The night settled over the building like a familiar benediction, bringing with it the peace that came from work well done, needs properly satisfied, and secrets safely kept. The establishment on Rue des Lombards joined the sleeping city in the quiet rest that would restore both body and soul for the challenges and opportunities that tomorrow would bring. The ancient and necessary work of providing comfort continued even in sleep, as dreams carried forward the gentle rhythms of service that had sustained such places through the centuries, offering to all who needed it the promise that comfort could be found, needs could be satisfied, and rest could be earned through the honest practice of the oldest and most necessary of human professions. The shutters were drawn, the ledger was closed, the lace was still, and the night waited without sound.